Howdy, all of you delicious people. I am here today to review Logan. Ultimately, knowing full well we are almost on the cusp, quite possibly within probably December, of presenting WandaVision, which eventually, of course, I will review. Knowing full well that it seems like the possibility of mutants, maybe not X-Men, maybe not New Mutants, maybe nothing of that kind, just mutants in general, could quite possibly be put into the MCU, and we have alluded within the WandaVision show to there being an illusion of there being a House of M like story, or very much rebuilding the X-Men into this MCU like world. Because ultimately, when looking at it, we have Doctor Strange that is very much going into a um a multiverse of madness that who knows what's going on with that movie. There could be any number of things going on, and when looking at that movie, it's like, God, there's going to be too much, I think, going on in that movie that everyone is going to probably get let down via that movie. Because reasonably, if they're like, man, I would have loved if we could have gotten like every single thing we could have ever wanted and more. And so reasonably, when going into that movie, I think it's going to either make a ton of people happy or a ton of people upset, because ultimately they are not going to get everything that they wanted from that movie, and they're eventually going to be upset about it. But it is what it is. At the end of the day, it's another movie that's hopefully eventually going to be put out sometime in the distant future from now, because looking at it, every single thing is in the way distant future of everything. So, like, it's lucky for us to get whatever we can to be put out there and be finally a thing we can finally see, ultimately in the near dear future. So, hoping on us very much having a real MCU mutant future, now we can go into Logan and go, okay, yeah, this is where the mutant kind ended. But I think when looking at it, I might just end up going backwards, and very much showing where a mutant kind had started and make our way back. So, ultimately, kind of alluding that I might eventually review some X-Men films, or any kind of X-Men mutant ash-like ties, with some exceptions. Like there might have been some mutant shows that ultimately honestly weren't that good, or ultimately there might have been some mutant movies that weren't exactly all that exciting. I have already reviewed the New Mutants, which ultimately is at theaters currently into the section's recording. I just have it on a different channel. More than likely, probably after thinking about this, once I review this movie, I will probably take that movie and put it over here, because it technically works for showcasing both these things simultaneously. And yeah, I don't think I've gotten any X-Men movies via that. So, anyways, look out for that, I guess, if you're just overall X-Men or mutant fans. So, going into this movie, and I apologize for this long lead up, I do apologize. So, reasonably within this film, bottled into this film, because reasonably, there are some tip of the hats to some X-Men stuff. I think very much this movie ties mostly to the X-Men films, but there is a tip of the hat of the Wolverine movie, which I will probably talk about much more in spoilers. If anything really going on to this film, I would have really loved there to be a like transitional like thing. But also when looking at it, I'm like, I think my biggest problem of this movie is there was no transition anywhere. Like it was just like, okay, here's just plop where they are now. And I think my biggest thing was just like I want backstory. Like I just don't want these people to just be where they are. And like I think over time I had to let that go. I had to let that go that this movie wasn't like telling me things. It was leaving too much into the lurk, or too much mystery was being put together. And I think that's what uh, kind of very much like annoyed me the most, was that there wasn't any, like I couldn't get closure, or I couldn't get like what I wanted out of all this, which was like a big opening of this movie to lead us to where Wolverine is now. And not saying that they would need to take like an extra hour to tell us what all happened with all the X-Men and all of and the Xavier Mansion and everything like that. You could have had it as a uh, really quick, like 10-minute opening, uh, or we could have just had it as like Wolverine like waking up from this horror dream, and that's what could have realistically been the movie. Just kind of quickly alluding to things, and that would have been enough, to be brutally honest. Going into this, I I really love how we have gone down to be it to where the last mutant kind esh like people are really just all broken characters that really have gotten to the point of them. I think the big holes in their hearts were really just the fact that kind of Wolverine mentions in this movie that supposedly mutant kind was supposed to be the next step, the next evolution, and instead it was just a fad, a phase, a thing that after time faded away, because ultimately X-Men, or ultimately mutants, there hadn't been a new mutant that has been able to pop up in the last 20 some odd years. So going into this movie, it really pushes the X-Men even more to realize that the entire times that they have been fighting with one another, to just now realize that they had probably either wiped themselves out in any number of things, but to realize how small of a species that they were, that like Xavier like almost at some points could have been right. You could have honestly said Magneto could have been right. That ultimately he very much wanting to see mutant kind Esh like prosper, and ultimately something as small as somebody looking too far into finding each new mutant, and going through a place where he had to wear a helmet, search through mutants, and search too hard into the sun to eventually lead us to where we are now, would really tell us that maybe Magneto was right and Xavier was wrong, and hence why maybe you can understand very much more where the last X-Men movie could go to, where where that last X-Men movie with John McAvoy had the Dark Phoenix, you could very much understand why Xavier gave everything up, because ultimately, justifiably, he would know where his future goes to if ultimately he would, of course, have his psychic like power. So, going into this movie, even tying in some X-Men movies that were actually, in my point of view, horrible, because they honestly were. The Dark Phoenix is probably the worst X-Men movie of all time, and I think Logan is pretty much pretty dang good once watching it again. Because again, I had to let go a lot of things after watching this movie. I had to let go a lot to ultimately just go into like, but the gap, the transitional gap. I don't know what happened between anything, and they're mysteriously alluding to a lot of things, and that's what I hated about this movie the most. Is it didn't tell us anything, and I think that's what hurt me the most. Was there was too much left in the air, and I guess the ultimate thought that there were going to be an X-Men movie that might tell us what got us to this point. So maybe that's reason why they kind of left so many things in the air, because they were maybe thinking quite possibly that they were going to do another X-Men movie if even though like both Patrick and Hugh Jackman had both said, "Hey, yeah, I'm not going to do any more. Like we're both kind of finally going to run off or right off to the sunset with these characters." So let's ultimately go into spoiler territory with these characters. It's very interesting to finally get to see Wolverine with basically everything left on the table. Basically, really, this time around, going, okay, we're going to try as much as possible to leave no stone unturned, and giving you like a rated R Wolverine, because this time around, that's what we're going to do. And that's what I can appreciate the most about this movie, is that we can have it to where more like Wolverine can cuss his way through everything, and this and that, like the f bombs and the shits and then this and that was all showcased and said throughout this movie. And ultimately, I haven't seen this movie done in black and white. I haven't seen the Wolverine edition that is done in noir. More than likely, I might even like that even more than the colored version. But I just thought that I would just go and do this version that I saw at last, and then eventually maybe dip into the noir version at some point in time. So, knowing full well the movie isn't different, it's just a visual change. So, let's go into spoiler time. Ultimately, this movie, I think with more viewings, this movie is actually better. Or also, probably if you would watch the other Wolverine movies and then watch this one, like all back to back or whatever, I think it's actually better that way. Because when honestly looking at it, you see Wolverine, specifically in his Wolverine movies, as a very tortured man, and you don't get that in the X-Men movies. You get that in the, because ultimately they have to be a little bit lighthearted and kind of a little bit upbeat. When you see the actual Wolverine films, you see Wolverine as a very tortured man, and he has nightmares and he's seeing things, and ultimately he is haunted. And that is a thing that I think needs to always be Wolverine, a man who is haunted. And so, reasonably, that is really pushing him to the brink of wanting to ride off into the sunset, is because he is a guy that cannot let things go. And that very much is what has built him up to be so angry, so upset, and to the point to where he is just desperately wanting to fight this all out, but he can't do it anymore. He can't fight it out. He can't fight through it, and that is the most interesting thing about this character. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So we open this movie up with Logan falling asleep into his limo, letting us know now that Wolverine has very much gone out of the X Mansion, or ultimately gone very far from beyond this loner guy in a motorcycle that would just drive away from, or ride away from all of his worries to the next mission, or the next thing to do. So Logan is in the limo hearing people trying to take off the hubcaps of his tires, ultimately to try to probably sell them somewhere. The funniest thing about this movie is probably this opening, because we ultimately have Logan, who is presented, or who is walking to these thugs trying to take his tires, and ultimately telling them, hey, like, if anything, please don't try and take these tires. You're just going to strip the lug nuts, and like, you're not going to be able to do what you do, or you're not going to be able to take these tires. So these guys immediately shoot Logan, and the funny thing, of course, is he gets right back up and he's like, guys, come on. It's like, that is the most funny thing, to see these people react and freak out to Logan getting right back up. That is the funny thing about this movie. And so that's like, I wish that this movie, like, at some points could have balanced between the very, like, the real heartbreaking stuff, and having little bits of stuff here where it's like, it kind of breaks so much of this, like, depression and sadness up by throwing a joke here and there every once in a while. Um, but ultimately, we have to where Logan gets back up and it's like, hey man, you're going to strip my tires. Like, please, like, don't hurt my car, because I need this car. So that's where we get it, to where, of course, the thugs circle around him. And the interesting thing about this beginning is Hugh Jackman's desperation to ultimately not letting these people hurt his car, to the point where he's jumping in front of bullets so that way his car doesn't get damaged. So we have to where, of course, Logan throws the claws out, but they're not fully coming out. Portions of them are coming out, because I think more than likely, Hugh Jackman, Logan is dealing with arthritis, and to where, like, he's having problems uh, with getting out the claws of his hands, because ultimately, like, his hands, after years of popping these things out, we eventually get it to where this time around, this Logan, this Wolverine, is freaking shoving his claws through people's heads, ultimately chopping off arms, chopping off legs, ultimately getting to the point to where these thugs are just like, oh my god, this guy is too skilled, and basically we thought that we could outnumber him, but reasonably this guy is just unstoppable. So we get it to where these thugs run off and jump in their van and drive away. So ultimately leading us to very much realize that we are going to actually start to see what Logan does now. Like, what is he doing? We ultimately see Logan very much driving people around, because really he is chauffeuring people around. It's kind of interesting to see Logan getting on a motorcycle and driving away from all of his problems. Now we have it to where Logan is just driving people around away from his problems, but he's doing it for money. And he's doing it in the desperation to eventually find some boat called the Sunseeker, I believe. I could be wrong about that boat. I ultimately, I hope I'm correct. So ultimately, we have it to where there's a montage of Logan going through these kind of rich people that are all kind of driving through this limo, and to where eventually Logan is at a funeral uh, of some woman, and ultimately we have Gabriella ultimately shouting out the word Wolverine or Logan and mentioning that she needs his help. And ultimately, Logan is very just like, no, 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 I'm not that guy anymore. No, get the F away from me. Um, and so the woman that is next to him, that is uh, who Logan is chauffeuring, is like, who is that woman? And and Logan goes, like, I don't know her, she's some crazy woman. And so eventually he gets back to his job and drives off. Again, Logan driving away from his problems. Ultimately, we find out that Logan is, after his jobs are over, he is driving to a hospital to get medication under the table. And so now we find out the villain of this story, because ultimately Logan goes back into his limo to be shockingly presented with a character called, I believe, Donald Pierce. Ultimately, Pierce mentions that he is asking for a woman, Gabriella, if he had seen her. And ultimately, Donald is saddened of the fact that he notices that Wolverine is a druggie because he was such a big fan of his. And so Wolverine has to ask, like, why, like, how did you find me? And ultimately, there had been a report of uh, people's limbs and things being chopped off, and ultimately there had been a car fitting his description with bullet holes in it, and so easily came up with a consensus that this is his. And because ultimately it would have been some bizarre animal attack, or ultimately it would have been, of course, him. So going into this, Logan tells him jack crap nothing, but of course Donald gives him his card and then leaves. So we have it to where the medication is not actually for Logan, the medication is actually for someone else. We find that Wolverine going to a seemingly factory-esh like place in New Mexico, or in Mexico, El Paso, ultimately leading to us finding out that that Wolverine is has been with Caliban, which you had seen him in probably X-Men Apocalypse, but you didn't really see him all that well. And plus, this Caliban is a much more different Caliban in this movie, because ultimately Caliban Apocalypse would consistently say his name consistently, and like it's kind of very bizarre because by and large it's like, okay, how is it that Caliban out of seemingly everyone was the one that survived out of all this? And because like I just don't quite get how Caliban was a much more powerful enough person to survive. And plus Caliban, we kind of find out he is a much more newer mutant, and so it seems that Caliban has confliction with Wolverine and with Xavier because they're kind of like generational mutants apart, because ultimately when Logan talks to Charles, ultimately we can get that consensus. So ultimately we go into Logan talking to Caliban, and reasonably it's kind of interesting to see Caliban talking to Logan, having to desperately have these conversations, because ultimately Caliban is just like, you know what, like I don't want to have to be cleaning up after you guys, and like giving you giving you your drinks every day, and 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 washing and drying your underwear and stuff like that. Like I'm getting tired of this. Like, when is it going to be to where uh you guys are gonna ship off into the sunset, because I'm done with this. Like, that's like, it seems like Caliban was kind of left to forcibly be put into this position, and because there's only so few mutants left. So it would be kind of interesting to see a tiny bit of backstory of how Caliban, even if it's a reference, of how Caliban got really to this point, because ultimately, like, he's a albino ash-like mutant that really sticks out. So like, I would just be kind of curious if they would just reference how he got to this point. And so yeah, it'd just be like, kind of like, how was he pushed to have to take care of them and wait on them hand to foot, and how he's just kind of sick of being their maid, and eventually is asking when are they going to get like the money together to get the boat that they're talking about. And plus, Caliban is kind of upset that ultimately Logan knows he has money for something, and because ultimately it's like they're barely surviving here with like barely any resources, and ultimately the more that he's poking at Logan, wanting to know something, the more Logan is telling Caliban to mind his own business, and this and that. It's kind of, I really like the dynamics between Caliban and Logan, to ultimately just be that Caliban is slowly but surely finding out things, even the adamantium bullet, and because really everything that Caliban is doing is driving to the fact of like, why am I here? What am I doing here? Like, I don't want to take care of you. I don't want to have to bury you. I don't want to have to clean up your blood after you shoot yourself, or Xavier like kills whatever is left of us in our sleep one night. Like, that is the most interesting thing about this movie, is the little portions of Caliban finding things about either what Wolverine's plans are, or like just getting much more frustrated about what is all going on. To me, I think that's interesting, but a lot of people could say, who cares? So within this big early moment, we're finding out like that Logan has what he hopes is a way out, which is his adamantium bullet, and Caliban is being frustrated that like for how long this is taking for Logan and them to ride off in the sunset or find somewhere else to actually legitimately live, because it just seems like they're in destitute, and ultimately Caliban is just tired of their crap. He's tired of taking care of them because ultimately Charles is a very difficult person to take care of. And that is very well noted to where Logan's first time of giving him medication. So we have it to where Logan goes to Charles in this big metal esh like container that is supposedly supposed to deafen Charles's power if he can actually use any of it at some portions of time. We start to get to know, or we start to like get to find out that Caliban had said that this medication isn't strong enough, but Logan is ultimately saying, well, it's like this is all I could get. Like this is all that this guy was willing to give me. And so reasonably, even though Wolverine is consistently forcibly feeding Charles these medications, I just don't think that they're strong enough for Charles. I just don't think that anything that Wolverine or that Logan could give Charles as medication at this point is really going to work. So we have it to where ultimately Logan is going to meet Charles, and Charles is spouting about nonsense. How basically he's talking about the new Taco Bell uh, Salupa or Chalupa or whatever, and he's spouting out all these nonsensical things from seemingly all these commercial ads that he's seen, and he's spouting out a bunch of nonsensical stuff from I think any book that he's ever read, and this and that, and we're starting to see Charles really completely go insane, or at some points close to it, because basically he's either hopped up on medication or realistically he is just really just stuck there and he can't go anywhere, so he's probably spent a number of years in this silo or this container that is supposed to contain his power, but recently I don't think it's quite all that powerful enough because Patrick is consistently talking about that he has talked to someone, and through a mental telephone, let's just say. So we have it to where ultimately Xavier, within these moments with Logan, at first is basically really very much treating Logan like crap, even though he's taking care of him. Like basically, like Logan is reminding Patrick that it's like, you know who I am, and and Charles is like, it's like, yeah, I know who you are, but like ultimately, like I'm just really ashamed of who you've become, and all of this stuff to really just throw in the face of Logan that is that's like he's taking care of him, but Charles is just really just like, God, like I am just so ashamed of you and this and that. It's like I guess for the numerous years and stuff that he had taken Logan under his wing, I guess that he would have thought that he would have softened him up. But honestly, when truly looking at it, when it comes to further along into the movie of us kind of alluding that Charles had probably killed the entire X-Men, I can understand why Logan could really be like very difficult towards Charles, just because it's like you've killed either everyone I loved, or you've killed all of my friends, you've killed everyone that meant anything to me, and but now I still have to wipe your butt. I still have to I still have to give you medications uh to really just have you be limping along onto your life. And it's also very vicious and interesting to see to where when Logan is walking away, to ultimately see Charles throw back at him, because all of this is very vicious and just so sad, because ultimately Patrick is or Charles is telling how like he hates Caliban because he can read in his mind that everything is about that he is a much older mutant kind than Caliban is, and there's so much um, confliction there between a new mutant and an older mutant. And so recently there's a lot of that's going on between those two characters, which we won't actually see. But we also get it to where Charles here brings up the Statue of Liberty and brings up uh, like at some point we eventually get to the point to where we kind of bring up what eventually happens to the X-Men, but that doesn't happen well later when they're at until they're at the Munson's house. But anyways, we get it to where as after Logan leaves after giving Charles his medication, ultimately Charles throws at him. It's like that that Logan is just waiting for him to die. I'm like, man, that is so vicious. It's like that basically like Charles is knowing that Logan is hoping that or Charles is knowing Logan is hoping that Charles is going to die soon, just so that way he won't have to worry about waking up in the middle of the night for Charles to have some seizure and to kill him in the middle of the night. So that is, I think, the whole thing is Wolverine is afraid of Charles, but then again, like there's so much stuff be going like there's so much stuff going between the the Charles character and the Wolverine character, where there's so much bitterness between the two and so much like stuff that we don't know that we have to understand and like try to dissect, and it would take too long to do that, to try to really understand like their backstory to get them to that point. And like that would take hours to decipher and this and that, and I don't want to take that kind of time. So ultimately we now push to forcibly it end up being that we have it to where that this to where Logan is going to eventually meet up with Gabriella at some point in this movie, because reasonably, like, Wolverine is ultimately thinking that, okay, like, this might be his last mission, and ultimately he is trying to drive away from all his problems, and now, like, he is no longer driving anywhere to a mission, and so him going with Gabriella to eventually have to meet Laura for the first time. Because what ends up happening is Gabriella tells him that she is going to pay him money. And so ultimately that might entice him to do this, if not anything else. So Gabriella has him do a job and is going to pay him money to transition them, I think, to New Mexico. And so, or to North Dakota, because that's where she wants to go. And so ultimately we have it to where Gabriella is barely showcasing Laura, but not exactly telling who Laura is to Logan. Ultimately, he will find out this later when he goes to try to retrieve her. So, ultimately, we have it to where Laura ultimately ends up uh, damaging a part of the hotel that she's at, and the owner notices it, and she's like, hey, you're gonna have to pay for that. And then ultimately Logan hits the owner with, like, hey, get your fat ass into the get your get yourself into the into your office, you'll get your money. So we have it to where Logan is going to take this job because the money sounds really good. He is ultimately very much, before this, he is kind of very much desperate to try to call on this boat once he hears that that Pierce is after him. And ultimately, he calls onto this boat to ultimately see if the person offering this boat will take a lesser amount of money, and the person just hangs up on him. So he's ultimately desperately uh, looking for money to ultimately get out of this, to get to um, riding off into the sunset. Because ultimately, once this Pierce guy has his claws into him, ultimately it's not like these people are going to stop. Like, Logan knows full well that they're going to come back for him. So Logan decides that ultimately he is going to take this job, and so he takes on the job with Gabriella, and so he's ultimately going to tell Charles that they're going to have enough money to get the Sunseeker. And so ultimately, we have it to where ultimately we have it to where Logan goes to tell Charles that they're going to have enough money to get the Sunseeker, and that they're going to have their ride off in the sunset. And Charles is happy about that. Logan is happy about that. and ultimately, like, Logan is kind of relaying that he will be gone for a couple of days to ultimately do this job to Caliban. And so when Logan ends up going to Gabriella at her hotel to get this job done, immediately he is finding her dead. And so he ends up kind of grabbing a couple things and then leaving. So we end up having Logan desperately scrambling to realize, okay, this woman is dead. We're probably next, so let's get out of here. So basically, Logan is deciding to scramble together and say, "Hey, we got to get out of here. Like, if anything, we have enough money for the Sunseeker now, and so let's get out of here." Because ultimately, we found out that this woman, uh, or ultimately, like, Logan was just like up in arms to just say, "Okay, like, we got to get out of here." Like, that's like, this woman's dead. Like, that was the last job I was gonna do. Let's get out of here. So ultimately, he was gonna get Caliban, and ultimately, uh, Charles out of there, and because ultimately this woman is dead. So, because ultimately it had to have been that Donald Pierce and them found out about him. So Logan goes back to the place of which that Logan and uh, and Caliban were at to warn them. It's like, hey, we need to desperately get out of here. Getting to the point where uh, he is very much as quickly as possible wanting to grab Charles and toss him into the limo and kind of tell like Caliban, it's like, hey, we got to get out of here. So because what ends up happening is when like Logan is trying as much as possible to crazily get whatever his crap is together to ultimately get out of there, um, Caliban is realizing that there is a backpack in the car, and we're like, oh crap. So we end up finding out that Laura had snuck in Logan's car to ultimately be hidden. And so we end up having Donald Pierce track down where Logan had been hiding Xavier. And so Donald ends up appearing and knowing full well that Logan did not tell Donald that he knows exactly where Gabriella was, and he is kind of hurt by that. So, and ultimately, he eventually notices Charles is in the limo, and he's like, "Oh, that must be Xavier." Like, "Oh, you've been hiding him away for so long." Ah, I see. Like, because ultimately, at first, he was like looking around to see. It's like, "Oh, were you hiding him in there? Oh, you must have been hiding him in there," because ultimately that could shield his power. But eventually, we have it to where Charles is in the limo, and then ultimately we have it to where we also find X-23 also in this limo as well. So we end up having it to where ultimately we have to where Logan ends up knocking out Donald, and eventually we have it to where Caliban ends up driving off with Donald to ultimately just drop off the body, throw the gun, and then Logan was going to pick him up. The only problem with that is Donald gets eventually right back up at some point when uh, Caliban is dropping off the body, and then holds a gun to Caliban to go right back to where they were, because ultimately Donald wants to use Caliban as a tracker to um, find Logan and Xavier as a means of just like, well, if I can't, like, if I keep losing these people, then I'll have a tracker to find them. So Donald ends up back appearing where Logan was, and ultimately Logan is asking where Caliban is. And now Donald Pierce ultimately has reinforcements. He has like a gang of people to all tries very much to take down Wolverine. The only thing is, Logan also has a card up his sleeve, which is X-23. We find Logan ending up finding X-23. Charles is still in the home, or Charles is in the home, ultimately talking to Logan that this is Laura, and ultimately talking Spanish to her, ultimately telling numerous times to her there's a tutu, and talking, saying the word train in Spanish and stuff like that. So Charles is trying to comfort her and trying to speak to her, and ultimately trying like very much to get to know her, because ultimately he had talked to her numerous times through some mind-esh like phone call. So ultimately we have to where Logan is just going to grab Xavier and just desperately just make his way out. And Xavier is screaming for Logan to don't forget Laura, don't forget Laura. And Logan is like, she's not our problem. Like, if anything, leave it for those people to go and get her, and like, I'm done. But we ultimately have it to where it's too late. Uh, Donald Donald Pierce and everybody kind of roadblock everything off for them to get out of there. So ultimately, Logan has to fight his way out. Ultimately, he starts taking down some of the guards, but realistically, they eventually find a way to beat Wolverine down. And Pierce again is just like, man, I'm so disappointed in you, Logan. Like, I'm so disappointed. And so eventually they are trying to figure out where X-23 is. They find out that she's in this little house-like thing, so they go in there to ultimately just get slaughtered. Basically, X-23 is killing her way through these people. Eventually, she makes her way out of this said home, to eventually just start to kill who's ever left. So ultimately, it ends up being Wolverine and X-23 kind of killing their way through who is ever left, to eventually drop into this limo to drive away. The only problem is there's not a real legitimate way to get out of here. So basically, Wolverine has to drive into a fence to get out of there. And like, that's like, basically he's driving as fast as he can within this limo to drive through this fence, and eventually he breaks through it. So ultimately we have it to where, of course, Pierce is still alive, and ultimately he's using Caliban to track them down. And at first, they end up in this very much hotel building, and ultimately we have it to where Logan is searching through X-23 stuff. But we also have it to find out that Gabriella also has a cell phone with information, some videos about what is going on with the New Mutants, and or the what would be deemed the New Mutants in this movie. So ultimately, we have it to where Wolverine is watching these videos, and because Charles is trying to convince Logan that this is his daughter, and he is completely and utterly not believing this, but he is starting to see some videos that Gabriella is showcasing about some of the stuff that they had gone through, and ultimately he is watching some of them, but then eventually the cell battery runs out. So ultimately he ultimately we have it to where X-23 is bizarrely going through a gas station and just grabbing a bunch of food and drink and just starting to drink it like as if she owned the place. And the person that is at this gas station is ultimately saying, "Hey, you're stealing stuff," and ultimately where's her parents? And so we have it to where X-23 is grabbing sunglasses because maybe that's the way that she likes to see the world, in a very much darker place. And so Logan ends up like realizing that X-23 had slammed this guy, and ultimately they just decide to just steal whatever. It seems that um, Wolverine ends up stealing some cigars, which he seemingly never uses, and then ultimately grabs the phone charger and then leaves. So it ends up to where Logan is charging the battery onto this phone and ultimately watching more of these videos for Gloria to tell him that it's like, well, hey, like this is not my daughter, but I love her, and ultimately letting you know that this is your daughter, and I hope that you protect her and this and that. Ultimately, Logan very much through this movie is having to realize that he, funnily enough, needs to wear glasses because he can't see that well. And ultimately, to have Charles tell Logan when he throws the sunglasses or the glasses on, it's like, oh, those make you look way younger. Much more distinguished or younger and stuff like that. I love the little shade that Charles throws sometimes. It is kind of funny. But yeah, we have Logan who is trying to find things out, and that's what I love about this movie is that Logan is a person that I guess could really give a crap. And that's what I like about this movie is showcasing that when it's a person that seems like nonstop he doesn't care, this is the time where he's searching for answers and actually really does care. And that is the most interesting thing about this movie is, and I think that's what gets you emotionally is finding out that this person really does care and wants to find out if this could really be truly his daughter, because Xavier is telling him, and Logan trusts him, and Gabriella is telling him this, and so now, um, because Logan had trusted her to want to take on this job, so we ultimately have it to where they're going to this hotel, and ultimately X-23 is looking at these cowboy hats and these clothes, And ultimately, Charles is like, hey, we need a change of clothes anyways. And so ultimately, Logan buys some clothes for them. And ultimately, like Xavier puts on this hat, and ultimately, he gives a hat to Logan, and he's like, "We'll get changed when we get to the room," which is kind of funny. So we ultimately find that Logan is going through Laura's stuff, and ultimately finds a comic book to shove in her face. Um, Ultimately, telling her that, and it's kind of interesting that they finally give us an X-Men book, an X-Men comic book inside this world. So we have it to where Logan is showcasing an X-Men book and basically telling her that a quarter of these stories are actually true, and because none of it actually looked or was the way it was. And so eventually telling Laura that her believing in these books and and really just building a life off of these comic books is a lie, and that ultimately um, she uh, really it's playing off that that hey, it's great that you're wanting to believe in a happy ending, but within Logan's life, it never really happened that way. And so he's kind of telling Laura, it's like, don't build don't build your life out of idolizing a story that is never going to have a happy ending for you. And Laura is very much growing very attached to Charles, because ultimately Charles is much more warm to her and is showing her some Western that he saw when he was a kid, and is kind of being much more warm and kind to her, and ultimately kind of uh, and this and that. So we have to where eventually Wolverine is throwing medication to Laura and telling in an hour, give it to him. So we have it to where Logan goes off um, to eventually get a different car, because ultimately he realizes that a limo is really going to stick out. And so basically, this limo that they had is basically demolished. So basically, he ends up scrambling to get some donkey looking car that only cost them like $8,000 or something. So we have it to where Logan ends up getting a new car and then ends up coming back. He comes back to find out that this entire hotel is frozen. And so ultimately, we find out that Xavier is having yet another one of his attacks. And so ultimately, Logan is making his way to the hotel to ultimately very much try and give medication to Charles so that way it would stop this seizure or attack. So while ultimately going to this room, he is finding out that the reason why he is having this attack is because he had been surprised by otherwise uh, every single one of these alkali like men or people that were there working for Pierce. So ultimately, I think Charles had tried to use his power, but that also went into very much his powers not being able to work all that well. So it went into very much seizure when he tries to use his power, because I think Charles is consistently trying to use his powers, even though all full well he shouldn't and or can't. So Charles is having his seizure, and so ultimately, Wolverine is clawing his way back to the room, ultimately killing every single one of these military-esque like men. Uh, to where ultimately he is making his way to Laura, who has the medication that she was trying to give to Charles, and Logan takes it from her and gives it to him, and every single one of the military Ashlight guys drop because they were end up mostly getting killed by Logan through getting to Xavier, and then X-23 kills the last guy. So they end up realizing that they have been found out, so they end up very much getting into the new car to drive away as soon as possible. So they get on the road, and eventually they end up finding a couple or a family that is struggling to get horses off the road because ultimately these horses had gotten loose. So ultimately Xavier is like, "Hey, maybe we should go to help them," and so ultimately, like, Logan is just not thinking about it, and he's like, "No, we're just gonna keep on driving. Like, they can go and help themselves." And Xavier's like, "Well, no. How about we? Like, we're here. We can help them." So Logan ends up dropping off to the side and is gonna go, "Okay, sure, fine, let's help them." But we find out instead that Charles uses his powers to ultimately get these horses back to where they all are. And ultimately, when Logan ends up going and trying to help out, it seems like they don't really have to do much because ultimately Charles is using his power. And then Logan is looking back on him like, "Are you using your power?" And Charles is like, "No, no, I'm not doing anything." Like, so we have it to where the horses get back into the little trailer that they're in, and the Munsons are just kind of grateful that Logan and them had stopped. So reasonably, they just decide, "Hey, how about you? Like, are you guys have you guys been on the road for a very long time? Um, do you guys want to just like come to our home and just kind of have a home cooked meal or something like that?" And Charles was like, "Oh, that would be wonderful." And so ultimately Logan is just like, "You know what, I just don't think," but Charles is just like pushing Logan so much here to have a home cooked meal and everything like that. So ultimately he feels forced to have to consent to just go, "Okay, sure." So ultimately Logan and family are all now going to the Munsons. Ultimately, Logan is making up different names for his family. Ultimately, saying that Charles is Chuck and all these kind of different names to ultimately go under different disguises and this and that for this brief time. So ultimately we end up having some kind of lighthearted moments where ultimately while they're finally having this home cooked meal, ultimately we find Charles kind of joking around about how ultimately mentioning how when the Munsons are thinking about going on a road trip, and we have it to where the younger son is thinking about dropping out of school to go with them. Ultimately we have it to where Logan mentions that Charles ultimately wouldn't probably be happy with his kid dropping out of school because ultimately he used to own a school, and that ultimately, and now Charles is mentioning how um, Logan used to go to that school, and so ultimately, like Logan mentions how many times that he's run away from that school and dropped out or whatever, and so Logan hits us or Charles hits us with, "Yeah, there were so many times that or there would be a time where I could say I admired you as a pupil, but I think I would choke on the words. So everybody has a little good joke, and everybody has a good time, and everybody's eating their meals. It gets to where Laura is grabbing a huge mound of corn, and Logan is just like, is trying to like get the spoon away from her, because it's like, good God, woman, like, you're eating a little bit too much there, buddy. Especially of one thing of corn. It's like, I know you're hungry, but like, come on. So it's like, eat like normal portions of stuff, because reasonably it's like we don't want to look like we're like starving Marvins or anything. So we have it to where ultimately we have a problem with the Munsons are bizarrely running short on water. And so ultimately they're realizing that they need to go and go to the water pipeline to turn the water pipeline on, because one of their neighbors is controlling how much water they're getting. Because ultimately we have it to where they're farmers, and so ultimately they really desperately need water, and they're thinking about, oh well, maybe we'll be fine because it had rained so much. It's like, no, like, if anything, go and check out like the water pump and just make sure it's working again, because our neighbors turn our water off. So we have it to where the son and the father of the Munsons are gonna go and check this out, but ultimately Logan's like, you know what? If I take my father uh, into bed, ultimately, like, I'll go with you. Like, believe me, I'll just go ahead and do it. I'll help you out because you gave us a home cooked meal. So Logan ends up taking Charles upstairs, and ultimately Charles is reminding Logan, like, this is what a real family is. Like, soak up these moments, because like, we're probably never going to get them again. And then Charles reminds Logan that he's like, I don't think I deserve these moments because of what had happened, alluding to the fact that Charles had quite possibly killed all of the X-Men, and that is why he doesn't deserve to have these family moments right now. So Logan just kind of walks away from this and goes to help out the Munson father getting their water turned on. So ultimately, we have it to where we have that moment where Logan is going all the way to get this water turned back on, and ultimately we get some moments where like the Munsons are kind of getting even more some backstory to where we can invest in these people, to where the moments are coming up next. So Logan turns the water on, and so eventually we have people that are coming to the evade of like, hey, why are you turning this water back on, boy? Why are you turning on this water, you guys? And so eventually Logan has to fight out those people, to where they're like, whoa, whoa. So they end up leaving to eventually come back later with guns and stuff like that. They end up coming back with numbers. They end up coming back with guns to fight out the Munsons at their farm. So ultimately, Munson is looking at Logan, and he's like, "Oh, like, did you have like you must have had training?" And he's like, "A little bit." Kind of really not telling this guy much about himself, and so really they go back to the farm, and they go back to start to slowly but surely find their family members or their people that they love dead, because here's what happens. So Caliban ends up tracking Charles and Logan, and so within Gabriella's video, we come to find out that supposedly they had come up with some different mutant after making all these children. they decided within this video that it seemed that they had come up with a new mutant and that they no longer needed all these children anymore, to the point where they were just going to kill them all off. Gabriella saw that and eventually tried to break them all free. Because ultimately, within this video, she was trying to make their lives a little bit better, trying to get them to have birthday songs and stuff like that, trying to treat them well. And we have a doctor coming in who is very much telling her not to comfort them, not to give them a shoulder to cry on, and because ultimately they need to build them up, uh, to manipulate them to be able to do whatever they wanted, and them coddling them is not going to help. So eventually, when coming up with this new mutant, they started to get rid of all the other kids, which got them to all escape. So we eventually find out now what this new mutant is, X-24. So we have it to where Charles is seemingly being woken up, assuming, because ultimately his powers are working, and it seems like in his ultimately he's realizing that Logan is in his room. And so Charles is starting to talk about things and stuff like that, and eventually he turns and Logan takes his hand to put on Xavier's chest. And then ultimately Logan ends up putting his claws through Xavier's chest, killing him off. I'm like, oh my god, this is crazy! And I'm like, oh my god, what is going on? But then we find out this Logan looks different. And this Logan is putting X-23 in these handcuffs in this little apparatus to where she can't break free. And then the Munson wife is holding a shotgun to what we think is Logan. And we're like, what is going on? And so we end up finding out that Caliban and them are all there, and they have released X-23, which is a Logan clone. And so here's the thing during this moment. A lot of people are thinking that Xavier died thinking that that Logan had killed him. Honestly, I would actually like to feel differently. Because, man, does that feel very brutal. And to me, like, I don't want Xavier to go out that way. I just don't. It seems horrific. But anyways, we have it to where we end up having Wolverine and the Munson father coming home. And we have it to where Wolverine is coming into the home of the slaughter of the Munson family. And then ultimately we have Logan, who is met with X-24, who is walking down the steps to greet him without saying a word. So we have it to where Logan is fighting X-24. And man, is these fights just awesome. Like we're having them fight throughout the home, we're having them fight throughout the yard and everything. Like these fights are awesome, but of course, like X-24 is a much younger version of Logan, so like he's gonna just outstrength him or outget him. So we have it to where accidentally X-24 ends up being presented with the farm people from the water that was being turned off, and they end up uh, fighting X-24, and the doctor who is in the big semi like truck, who's watching over X-24 do his thing, and how basically they've noticed that he's merciless and that he'll just kill whoever. Ultimately, they're excited up to the point of like X-24 just noticing that he's just killing everybody, and then he's like, "Oh no, 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 no!" Like, don't kill that person. So, and plus, Wolverine is outnumbered with a bunch of farm guys that all have shotguns. So, we end up having it to where ultimately Logan is trying to take down X-24. We have it to where X-23 is just kind of in cuffs and she can't really get anywhere. So, we have it to where the Munson father ends up taking a shotgun to X-24 and ends up killing him, and then Logan gets back up, and he was almost going to shoot Logan, but he ran out of bullets, and then he drops down because ultimately X-24 had taken a pretty good chunk out of him. So we end up having Logan, who runs to Charles Xavier and telling Charles, because Charles is still alive, he's still talking to him, and Wolverine tells him, "It wasn't me, it wasn't me, believe me, it wasn't me." And that's where I think that you could say that Charles doesn't believe that Wolverine killed him, because he's convincing him it wasn't him. And the last moments that Logan and Charles have together, Charles is still reminding Logan about the the ride that they were going to have off to the sunset. The sun gazer was their way out. The Sunseeker was their ride off to the sunset, and ultimately that's Xavier's last thing that he tells Logan is like, "The Sunseeker, Logan, the Sunseeker." And to me, I was so heartbroken by that moment to see that this was Charles's right off to the sunset, and ultimately his last thing to say to him was going to be, "Well, if I'm not going to get the Sunseeker, then maybe I'll go off my way to heaven to be, because it's either Sunseeker or it's heaven." So that was just a heartbreaking moment to watch. Xavier's last gasp was to mention and remind Logan about their happy ending together. And so that was just an emotional moment. And to now have Charles still transition to very much try to get an X-23, try to get the heck out of there, because ultimately he's just realizing that eventually it's never going to stop. These people are going to keep coming after him. And also X-24 is still coming after him, seemingly no matter what. And so it ends up Logan tries to unlatch X-23 to have one kind of last fight out with the other Logan, and then like try to get the heck out of there, drive their way out. We have it to where ultimately the doctor that is with that is with the the alkali, or the with Pierce, ultimately is going to give X-24 medication to be stronger, to ultimately heal faster, and for him to do a round two with Logan and X-23. So we ultimately have it to where Logan is so exhausted from fighting X-24, and it seems like he's gone seemingly I don't know how long without actual sleep. And so he is just driving to no ends, and ultimately he is starting to fall asleep, to where X-23 is begging to him for her to drive. Because ultimately what ends up happening is is that Logan has to go to somewhere that is just by water and bury Charles, sadly enough. And he has this moment of basically just saying, like, well, we almost made it. It's by water. And like he keeps repeating, it's by water. Like, ultimately we didn't make it, but I guess this is just going to have to desperately be close enough. And to see Wolverine break down like this, and to ultimately like be so miserable and depressed that he ultimately didn't get money enough to get them to their road off to the sunset, to their Sunseeker, and them off to water, is just so much to the point to, I think, wanting to drive Wolverine even more to just wanting this all to be over, because he he wanted, if he wanted to go out, he wanted to go out with Charles, and he didn't get that. And like everything else in his life that he didn't get, he didn't want, or he struggled to get through. And so to not be able to share those last moments with Charles really very much was just another thing of him not being able to have, and to that's where it driving him even more to just looking at X-23 as just like, well, I guess I'm just gonna drive away from all this, drive away from Charles, to just do one last mission, to hope that this time around this mission will do me in, sadly enough. So we have it to where like Logan is just so frustrated with X-23 because, or with Laura, because it's just like it's a generational thing, but it's just the fact that like she wants to go to North Dakota, and Wolverine has said to her, by looking at the comic book, as the exact same address is the address that is on the girl's yellow envelope that Gabriella was going to give to him. Everything of that address was a lie. It was nothing true. It was all made up in some comic book, and X-23 is not going to get the happy ending because Logan thinks that he's not going to get his happy ending, so why should X-23? So, like, there's a whole issue with that, to where Logan is just so mad, and he doesn't want to give X-23 her happy ending, her fantasy world, her Disneyland, and but ultimately he is just so frustrated that that's what he has to do because he has nowhere else to go. So ultimately he goes and he starts driving to the point of him getting brutally and utterly exhausted, to the point where Laura eventually tells him to go to sleep, and she stubbornly goes and drives the car to this location and ultimately has it to where Logan is now forcibly in North Dakota, and he is now with these new mutants. Ultimately, very exhausted, consistently going into a bunker or wherever to just kind of sleep things off. Uh, Ultimately, they have to forcibly give him some mutant medication, and ultimately, he doesn't want it because it's going to make him angry. And it's like, well, no, only given in small doses. So we end up having to where Logan is telling Laura, it's like, well, hey, like, you got what you wanted. You got your fantasy land. You got your happy ending. And he is basically mentioning, it's like, well, hey, like, I guess, like, I can have mine now because I have my adamantium bullet. Because ultimately she finds the adamantium bullet and he's like, give that to me, that's mine. And ultimately, because he he basically tells her his ending plan is that ultimately he wanted to go out like that, and but ultimately he wanted to go out like that the right way, which was at the Sunseeker, but he has to come up with his own way out. So ultimately we have it to where Logan is feeling a little bit better and realizing that, like, okay, like, Laura is happier here. Maybe I should try to be uh, happier here and maybe try to give her some last words of wisdom before I'm on my way out. So Wolverine ends up looking through these big giant binoculars because he's end up seeing some like weird uh, tech things that are kind of flying around. And so he ends up seeing these small drones and he's like, oh crap. So he's telling all the new mutants that ultimately, hey, like there's some drones flying around, there's some people coming. So I think it's your time to get out of here, to run away. And so you start to see them like scrambling through the forest, ultimately to be met by, who do you think? X-24. And you just kind of see this fight out between X-24 and Logan again, and to the point to where Logan is really getting hurt by Logan's really getting hurt by X-24, and but eventually this fight out eventually ends with Laura using the antimanium bullet on X-24 and blowing a portion of his head off. So, but we have it to where the New Mutants are on the run, and they're having to forcibly be up against all of Pierce's henchmen. And so basically after Logan is exhausted through this X-24 fight out, what he ends up just doing is he ends up taking every single bit of that green medication, shoving it into him and taking all of it so that way he can be angry enough and powerful enough to take all the rest of Pierce's men out. So we have it to where Logan ends up just start decking people and killing people, running around and slicing and dicing people. Like it's like awesome, and you see like Wolverine so angry and so amped up, and to where eventually once like he is almost getting to Pierce to take the last people out, he is easily and quickly getting exhausted, and X-23 is grabbing onto him and mentioning, it's like, you took all the medicine, didn't you? And he's like, yeah, I had to. So ultimately they are making their way to Pierce, and ultimately Pierce and the doctor are there because ultimately Caliban ended up taking a grenade to himself. Once finding the New Mutants, he ended up taking a grenade to himself because ultimately he didn't want them to use him any much more longer to find any last remaining mutants. And so Pierce had to run out of the truck or whatever that they were in before Caliban ends up wiping himself out. So the doctor ends up mentioning to Logan how this doctor was tied to Stryker, and that ultimately it was his Stryker was his father. And so that's where we kind of get the overall tie to the X-Men story, is just having the next generation of a Stryker to go after him. So we have it to where the doctor is telling Logan about what they were trying to do here, and ultimately that they realized that like these kids were pointless to try to manipulate, when ultimately they could have just gotten X-23 to try and take them out. But anyways, so we have it to where ultimately, and I might be saying these things out of order, but ultimately that's kind of where things go. So ultimately we have it to where we have it to where Pierce ends up getting taken out by the New Mutants. They end up like at first when they were starting to attack people, we have to where Pierce ultimately gets subdued by all the New Mutants, ends up being suffocated and everything like that by the New Mutants. So they actually kind of barely do something. Because at first, one of the New Mutants actually tries very much to subdue X-23 by throwing a military-esque like car on him, which I think happens earlier. I think the animating bullet ends up happening later, so I apologize about the confusion. Um, but ultimately, that just slows X-24 down. And so here's how X-24 ends. So they end up slowly but surely end up taking Pierce ends up being killed. The Doctor ends up unleashing X-24. That's where they have their big last fight out, where X-23 is fighting them, and Logan is trying to fight X-24, and to where ultimately it leads to an animating bullet in X-24's head, and then because ultimately some of the New Mutants try to take out some of the other lackeys. Like they end up freezing some guy's arm and basically breaking it off, which was kind of cool. But the New Mutants don't really do much of anything. It's all coming down to X-23 and Logan to kill all these things off. You would think they would have tried to at least try to have these other mutants do something, but it ends up being what it is. So X-24 shoves Logan into this tree branch, and basically that is how he is done in. And so ultimately we have it to where after shooting an animantium bullet into X-24, finally really killing him off now that I finally had gotten that correct, because I apologize. So X-23 just chops off the branch for Logan to much more sit down, much more peacefully, and ultimately Logan is giving her one last kernel of wisdom, because after Charles had died, X-23 and Logan had gotten very closer, but then again, um, Logan was very much uh, telling X-23 she wasn't going to get her happy ending, because life never happens that way. But anyways, Logan basically tells her, it's like, well, hey, like you got your happy ending. You're with your kind. You're with your people. Um, Ultimately, telling her before, like, the names that she rattled off and everything like that. Like, now she's with these people, and now she should be happy. And her huzzah for her. To her now, Logan is basically telling her, like, hey, like, don't become what they wanted you to be. Like, be who you want to be. Like, don't end up forcibly just becoming a machine for them uh to forcibly be this killer, this whatever. So Logan is feeling that he is giving her like really small kernels of wisdom, and then eventually kind of going and bowing out to be able to finally die. And ultimately he's like, oh, this is what this feels like. So we ultimately see Logan die, and then the New Mutants end up burying Logan, and that's how the movie just ends. So yeah, ends with a Logan burial, end up taking down the cross to ultimately put an X there, and then the New Mutants end up leaving. So ultimately, we could take this any number of ways. That ultimately we could timeline this out and make it so where Logan never happened, or ultimately we can have it to be that Logan comes back from the grave, or any number of things. If they want to go with yet another Hugh Jackman Ash like story, I would probably just rather have it to be, if they're going to do like a Days of Future Past thing, have a younger Logan, or reboot this whole thing and just be like, well, hey, this is your conclusion of the Hugh Jackman Wolverine. We're no longer going that direction. Uh, yeah, it could be an entirely rebooted, because they already technically tried to reboot the X-Men world, still with Hugh Jackman in it. So I thought that was kind of a waste. I'm like, if you're going to completely reboot the thing. But no, they kind of like, well, we're like, yeah, but Hugh Jackman makes a lot of money, and everyone was begrudgingly thinking about that. And so when Hugh Jackman had a cameo in First Class, again, that's where they kind of went with the fact of like, well, if we don't have Hugh Jackman in an X-Men movie, it won't make money. I'm like, no, if you just have a really good enough Wolverine that people will buy into, then ultimately that's where you're going to make your money. If you're just going to cast any schmuck to be Wolverine because you don't think it matters, then that is what's going to hurt you in the end. Supposedly, I've heard that they have recasted a new Wolverine, but you can't confirm anything. And at the end of the day, supposedly that casting was a X amount of time ago. you can't really trust anything comes through and says, oh yeah, this person had been casted as Wolverine, because as a new Wolverine, because ultimately, until you put pen to paper and say, okay, or put really not even much more pen to paper, if you actually have him on a screen somewhere being Wolverine in some trailer, then people will go, okay, all right, it's finally happening. They're going to have a Wolverine at the end of WandaVision, because I'm assuming they're probably going to do some kind of X-Men like thing, X-Men tie, justifying some of these characters that I don't know how you could really justify, because how is Quicksilver probably going to know the rest of the X-Men when Scarlet Witch doesn't know much of the X-Men? It's going to be a whole bunch of time jumping, whatever stuff that doesn't make any sense, and we'll just have to figure it out when we get there. But I don't know. I'm kind of interested to see what is the future of the mutants. But anyways, I'm going to kind of look back on some of the X-Men things and stuff like that. I apologize for mixing up that whole X-24 thing. Uh, Ultimately, there was a portion there. I'm like, well, how did he get hurt originally? Then I'm like, oh yeah, he ended up getting dropped. Okay, sure. So a little bit of a mess up there. But anyways, yeah, let's hopefully go into more X-Men movies at the end of the day. Yeah, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.